Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Shabbat. We're up to Perek Yud Aleph Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. In the conclusion of yesterday's Mishnah, we discussed a case of someone who throws an object from one private domain to another private domain through a public domain that is between them. We brought down a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the sages. Rabbi Akiva held that the person is liable to bring a korban chatat because when the object passes through the public domain, it's viewed as if it came to rest there, whereas the sages disagreed and they held that the person is exempt from having to bring a korban chatat because the object did not land in the public domain and it's not viewed as if it did. Today's Mishnah elaborates on the view of the sages. So the Mishnah begins, Ketzad, what is the case of the previous Mishnah in which a person transfers an item from one private domain to another private domain to a public domain, and the sages held that he is exempt. The Mishnah says, Shete gizuz teraot zu keneged zu b'reshut harabim. If there are two balconies, each with the dimensions of a private domain, that face each other on opposite sides of the public domain, which the Mefarshim explain, and I urge everyone, if you could see the article elucidated, the diagram A that they bring, or any other illustrated version of the Mishnah to try to picture the situations. But the commentary is right, each balcony is at least 4 tefachim long by 4 tefachim wide, and as walls around it are at least 10 tefachim high, as Tosfos says on Masechet Shabbat, page 99a. So again, if there are two balconies that face each other on opposite sides of a public domain, hamoshit v'azorek mi'zo lazu patu. Whether a person hands the item or throws it from one balcony to the other, he is exempt. Now, this is the view of the sages of the preceding Mishnah, of yesterday's Mishnah, who do not accept the principle that Rabbi Akiva said of kiluta kimishu necha, that something contained in the airspace of a domain is viewed as if it has come to rest in it. They disagreed with that concept. Now, since the item never rested in the public domain and is not viewed as if it did, one who transfers it from one balcony to the other is not liable for transferring from a reshut hayachid to a reshut harabim. The Mishnah now contrasts the preceding case in which one is exempt for transferring across the public domain with the following case of transferring through a public domain for which a person can sometimes be liable. Hayu sheten bidyota achat. If both balconies were coming out of one upper story, meaning both were on the same side of the street. Now, both balconies jutted out over the Reshut Harabim from the upper floor of the same building and were therefore lined up along the length of the Reshut Harabim with an open space over the Reshut Harabim between them. Again, if you could see the diagram B, that will help visualize the case. But again, Hayushten bidota ahad, if both balconies were coming out of one upper story, meaning they were both on the same side of the street, hamoshit hayav, one who hands an item from one balcony to the other is liable, vazoek patur, but one who throws the item from one balcony to the other is exempt, shekach hayta budat Levim, because this was the way the Levim did their work in the desert. Shete agalot zo achazu b'reshut harabim. They set up two wagons, one behind the other, lengthwise in the public domain, which the commentaries explain, when the Jews traveled in the desert, the Levi'im were responsible to take apart the Mishkan and transport its parts with them to the new encampment. So to transport the beams, they used 4 wagons, each with the dimensions of the Reshut Hayachid. Now these wagons were lined up in the Reshut Harabim outside the Mishkan in 2 pairs, one pair behind the other. The Levi'im would dismantle the Mishkan, would pass the beams to Levi'im in the pair of wagons nearest the Mishkan, and those Levi'im would then pass the beams to Levi'im in the pairs of wagon further from the Mishkan. So again, the Mishnah continues, Shekach hayta avodat Levi'im, because this was the way the Levi'im did their work in the desert. Shtei agalot zo achazu b'reshut harabim. They set up 2 wagons, one behind the other, lengthwise in the public domain. Moshitina kirashim mizo lazu, and they handed the beams of the Mishkan from one wagon to the other along the length of the public domain. Avalo zokin, but they did not throw the beams from one wagon to the other. Now the Mefarshim explained the beams were lifted from the ground and given to the Levi'im standing on the first wagon, who then passed them to the wagon in front of them until it was loaded. The beams, however, were never passed to the wagon alongside. They also did not throw the beams because they were too heavy and so that they would not get damaged. And therefore we learn from their procedure that one who hands something from one private domain to another along the length of the public domain is liable. However, one who throws something along the length of the public domain is exempt, since there's no precedent in the work of the Levim to make this a melacha. Now, according to the sages, the Mefarshim explain, one is liable for transferring items from one Reshut Hayachid to another through a Reshut Harabim only if he transfers in the same way it was done in the Mishkan in the desert. Now the Levim transferred the beams only by handing them, not by throwing them, and they transferred them along the length of the Reshut HaRabim, not across its width. Therefore, a person who throws an item from one Reshut Yachid to another along the length of the Reshut HaRabim, or who hands it across the width of a Reshut HaRabim instead of its length, is exempt from liability. Now, although usually a melacha doesn't have to be exactly how it was done in the Mishkan to be considered a toladah, the melacha of transferring, the Mefarshim say, is an exception, because transferring is an unusual type of melacha, since it's not forbidden between all domains, only between public and private ones, and therefore we can therefore not logically include it in anything that does not correspond exactly to the procedure in the Mishkan from which we learned. And this is how the Tosfot Yom Tov brings it down, and this is how Tosfot explains it on page 2a in Masechet Shabbat. The Mishnah now returns to the subject of transfers between a private domain and public domain. The earth removed from a pit and piled around its edges like a wall, and a rock that are 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide are deemed private domains, which Mefarshim explain, the rock is 10 tefachim high on its own. Now, in the case of the earth around the pit, the Mishnah means that it's 10 tefachim deep, measuring from the top of the earthen rim to the bottom of the pit. Therefore, the top of the rock and the inside of the pit are each considered a reshut hayachid. Hanoten mehen v'hanoten al gaban hayav. One who takes an item from one of them and places it in the public domain, or one who takes an item from the public domain and places it on one of them, is liable for transferring an item between private and public domains. Pachot miken patu. However, if the dimensions of the earth around the pit, plus the depth of the pit itself, or the dimensions of the rock are less than 10 tefachim high or 4 tefachim wide, then one who takes an item from them and places it in the public domain or vice versa is exempt, because he didn't transfer an item between a private and a public domain. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now discusses the prohibition against moving an item 4 amot in the public domain, which is a tolada, an offspring of the melacha of transferring. Hazorek 4 amot bakotel lemala me'asrat tefachim. If someone throws an item like a sticky fig cake 4 amot in the public domain, and it sticks to a wall in the public domain above 10 tefachim from the ground, kezorek ba'avir. It's as if he threw it in the air and it never landed, because the airspace above 10 tefachim is not considered part of the public domain, and therefore he has not violated the prohibition of transferring 4 amot in the public domain. Now, Reshut HaRabim extends only to a height of 10 tefachim, the Rav says. Everything above that is considered a makom patur, an exempt area. Lemata me'asrat tefachim kezorek ba'aretz. But if it's stuck to the wall within 10 tefachim of the ground, it is as if he threw it on the ground and it landed there. Now, since it's stuck to the wall, it's considered to have landed, and since it's within 10 tefachim of the ground of the Reshut HaRabim, it is considered to have landed in the Reshut HaRabim, as Rashi tells us on page 7b in Masechet Shabbat. The Mishnah continues, says, Zorek ba'aretz 4 amot hayav. One who throws an object 4 amot onto the ground of the public domain is liable. It's a continuation of the previous case. Again, lemata me'asrat tefachim kezorek ba'aretz. Hazorek ba'aretz 4 amot hayav. If it's stuck to the wall within 10 tefachim of the ground, it's as if he threw it on the ground and it landed there. And one who throws an object 4 amot onto the ground of the public domain is liable. And the Mefarshim explain, since the wall is 4 amot away from where the fig cake was thrown, landing on the side of the wall is like landing on the ground 4 amot from the point of where you threw it, as Rashi says on page 7b in Masechet Shabbat. Even if most of the fig cake remains within the original 4 amot, the thrower is liable as long as the place on which the fig cake landed, meaning the side of the wall, is 4 amot away, because the fig cake is considered to be in that place, as again the Mefarshim explained to us. Now the Mishnah continues, Zarak letoch 4 amot v'nitgalgel chutz 4 amot patur. If someone threw an item intending that it land within 4 amot of where he's standing, but it rolled beyond 4 amot and then stopped there, he is exempt because he didn't intend to throw it there, and we know one is not liable for a melacha that he did not intend to do. He doesn't have to bring a korban for that. Chutz 4 amot v'nitgalgel letoch 4 amot hayav. If he threw an item intending that it land beyond 4 amot, and it landed there for a moment, but it rolled back into his 4 amot, he is liable because he intended to throw it far enough to be liable, and it landed there for a moment. The fact that the item rolled back into his 4 amot doesn't undo the desecration of Shabbat that already had happened when it rested momentarily past his 4 amot, and therefore he is liable. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.